It all started when Jake, my best friend since college, called me out of the blue one night. "Man, I hate to ask, but I'm kind of out of options," he said, his voice unusually tense. Jake explained how his landlord had decided to sell the house he was renting, giving him barely any notice to move out. He'd been couch surfing for the past week, sleeping wherever he could, and was running out of places to go. "Every decent place I've looked at is way out of my budget," he said. "And the ones I can afford? Total dumps." Jake wasn't the kind of guy to complain or ask for help, which made his situation hit even harder. "Why don't you stay here for a while?" I said without hesitation. There was a pause. "At your place? With you and Emily?" Emily was my girlfriend of 3 years. We lived together in a 2-bedroom apartment that wasn't huge, but it worked for us. "Yeah," I said. "We've got the spare room, and it's just sitting there. Crash here for a bit, save up, and figure things out from there." "I don't know, man," Jake said. "I don't want to get in the way or mess things up with Emily." "You won't," I assured him. "It's not forever, just a month or so. Emily likes you, and we've got the space." Jake hesitated again, then finally sighed. "If you're sure." "Positive," I said. "Swing by tomorrow, and we'll get you set up." The next morning, over breakfast, I told Emily about the plan. "Jake's been sleeping on couches," I said. "He doesn't have anywhere else to go." Emily frowned, her concern immediate. "That's awful. He can't keep living like that. I told him he could stay here for a while. Just until he finds a place," I said. Emily nodded. "Yeah, of course. He's a good guy, and he's always been great to you. Just let him know it's temporary, okay?" "Absolutely," I said. Jake showed up that afternoon with everything he owned packed into his car. It wasn't much, just a few suitcases, his gaming setup, and some clothes. Emily greeted him at the door with her usual warmth. "Come on in," she said. "We've got everything ready for you." "Thanks, Emily," Jake said, giving her a tired but grateful smile. "You have no idea how much I appreciate this." The 3 of us spent the day getting him settled. The spare room wasn't fancy, just a bed, a desk, and a closet, but Jake seemed relieved to finally have a place to land. That first week, Jake fit in surprisingly well. He was polite and helpful, cooking dinner a couple of nights and keeping his room spotless. He even insisted on chipping in for groceries. "You're doing me a huge favor," he said. "The least I can do is pull my weight." Emily seemed to appreciate the extra help. "Jake's great," she said one evening. "It's nice having someone else around." I had to admit, it was nice having him there. The 3 of us would hang out in the evenings, watching movies or joking about old college stories. For a while, it felt like we were all just having fun. But as the days went on, I started to notice small things. The first week of having Jake in the apartment flew by. He made himself useful in ways that honestly surprised me, taking out the trash, cleaning the bathroom without being asked, and even cooking dinner a few times. "You're spoiling us," Emily joked one night as Jake served up a surprisingly good stir-fry. Jake laughed, brushing it off. "Least I can do. You guys are saving my butt right now." Emily and I exchanged a quick look, both smiling. Having Jake around felt almost nostalgic, like the easy days of college when life was less complicated. By the second week, Jake had fully settled into the spare room. He spent most of his days job hunting or gaming, though he never let his hobbies get in the way of pitching in around the house. "Got another rejection email today," he said one evening as we were clearing the table. "Keep at it," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Something will come through." "Yeah, but it's starting to feel hopeless," he admitted. Emily chimed in from the kitchen. "You'll figure it out, Jake. You're smart, and you've got people rooting for you." He smiled at her, his mood visibly lifting. "Thanks, Emily. I appreciate that." It was a small moment, but I couldn't help noticing how easily she'd put him at ease. The 3 of us fell into a comfortable routine. We'd have dinner together most nights, then relax in the living room watching TV or playing card games. Jake had a knack for turning even the most mundane evenings into something fun. One Friday, he convinced us to have a game night. We pulled out an old board game from the closet, the kind we hadn't touched in years, and spent hours laughing at his over-the-top strategies and ridiculous attempts to cheat. "Jake, you can't just make up rules as you go," Emily said, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "Sure I can," Jake said with a grin. "It's called being creative." Even I had to admit, his energy was infectious. For the first time in a while, it felt like we were just enjoying life without any stress. But as the second week went on, I started to notice little things that didn't sit right. One evening I came home from work to find Jake and Emily in the kitchen, laughing about something. Emily was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed, while Jake was gesturing animatedly. "What's so funny?" I asked, dropping my bag by the door. "Jake was just telling me about this time in college," Emily said, smiling at him. "It's nothing," Jake added quickly, brushing it off. It wasn't anything overt, but something about the way they both stopped talking when I walked in made my stomach twist. Another night, I stayed late at work to finish up a project. When I texted Emily to let her know I'd be late, she replied, "No problem. Jake and I will just hang out." By the time I got home, it was past 10 p.m. The apartment was quiet, but the faint glow of the TV spilled out from the living room. I walked in to find Emily and Jake sitting on the couch. They weren't sitting too close, but it was close enough that it made me pause. "Late night?" Emily asked, glancing up at me. "Yeah," I said, my voice neutral. "What are you guys watching?" "Some action movie Jake picked," she said, gesturing to the screen. Jake grinned. "You'd like it, lots of explosions." I sat down in the armchair, trying to shake the nagging feeling in my chest. It wasn't anything concrete, but I couldn't help noticing how relaxed they seemed together. By the third week, Jake still hadn't found a place, though he promised he was trying. "I sent out 3 more applications today," he said one morning over breakfast. "Good," I said, though I was starting to feel impatient. Emily, on the other hand, was endlessly supportive. "You'll find something," she said. "It just takes time." I tried to brush off my irritation, telling myself it wasn't fair to resent Jake for something out of his control. But the truth was, I didn't like how comfortable he and Emily seemed to be around each other. One Saturday, I decided to head out for a few hours to clear my head. When I told Emily, she glanced at Jake and said, "Why don't you take Jake with you?" "I've got stuff to do here," Jake said quickly. It struck me as odd, but I didn't press it. When I got back later that afternoon, the apartment was quiet. Emily was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, while Jake was in his room with the door closed. "What did you guys do while I was out?" I asked, grabbing a glass of water. "Not much," Emily said with a shrug. "Just hung out." Her tone was casual, but something about the way she avoided my eyes made me pause. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jake and Emily weren't doing anything obviously wrong, but their closeness was starting to bother me in ways I couldn't ignore. Maybe I was overthinking things. Or maybe I wasn't. By the third week, something had shifted in the apartment. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint exactly, but the dynamic between Jake and Emily felt different. Jake was still his usual helpful self, cracking jokes and pulling his weight around the house. Emily was her usual upbeat self, smiling and chatting about her day. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But it was the small things that started to eat at me. One evening I came home from work a little earlier than usual. I walked through the door, expecting the usual quiet hum of the apartment. Instead, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. As I stepped in, I found Emily and Jake sitting at the counter, a bottle of wine between them. "What's the occasion?" I asked, dropping my bag on the floor. They both looked up, startled. "Nothing," Emily said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "We just opened a bottle with dinner." Jake gave me a sheepish grin. "We saved you a glass." I glanced at the half-empty bottle and the 2 glasses on the counter, my stomach twisting. "I'll pass," I said, my tone neutral. The tension in the room was subtle but palpable as I walked past them to the living room. Later that night, as Emily and I were getting ready for bed, I decided to bring it up. "You and Jake seemed pretty cozy earlier," I said, trying to keep my voice light. She frowned, looking at me in the mirror as she brushed her hair. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "I just didn't know you two were drinking together." "Matt, he lives here," she said, her tone defensive. "We were just talking. It's not a big deal." "I didn't say it was," I replied, though her reaction felt like a red flag. Emily sighed, putting down her brush. "You're being weird about this. Jake's your best friend, remember? He's not some stranger." "I know," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The next day, I tried to shake off my doubts. Jake was my friend, and Emily was my girlfriend. I had no reason to think there was anything more going on. But the feeling wouldn't go away. A few nights later, I walked into the living room and found Jake and Emily watching a movie. They were sitting closer than usual, the kind of casual closeness that felt just a little too intimate. "Room for one more?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Of course," Emily said, scooting over slightly. I sat down on the couch, trying to ignore the tension in my chest. The movie played on, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the way they seemed to be in their own little world. The turning point came the following week. I had a late meeting at work and texted Emily to let her know I wouldn't be home until after 10. "No worries," she replied. "Jake and I will just hang out." When I finally got home, the apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the TV in the living room. I walked in to find Jake and Emily on the couch, both looking up at me like they'd been caught. "Late night?" Emily asked, her tone overly casual. "Yeah," I said, glancing at the empty wine glasses on the coffee table. "Looks like you guys had fun." "Just watching a movie," Jake said quickly, standing up. "I was about to head to bed." Emily gave me a tight smile, but she didn't say anything else. That night, I lay awake, replaying the evening in my head. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe there was something going on that I didn't want to admit. Either way, I couldn't ignore it anymore. By the end of the 3rd week, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut anymore. Jake and Emily weren't doing anything blatantly inappropriate, but there was something about their closeness that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the laughter or the private jokes. It was the way they acted when they thought I wasn't watching. One evening, Emily and I were sitting on the couch after dinner. Jake had excused himself early, saying he had some emails to catch up on. "Do you think Jake's settling in okay?" Emily asked, tucking her legs under her. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Why?" "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "He just seems, I don't know, a little restless. I think he feels bad about staying here so long." "It's only been 3 weeks," I said, though I couldn't help agreeing. Jake hadn't mentioned moving out recently, and I was starting to wonder if he was getting too comfortable. Emily leaned her head back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "He's such a good guy, though. He's been through a lot lately." Her tone was casual, but something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. The next day, I came home early from work. I'd finished a big project ahead of schedule and figured I'd surprise Emily and Jake with takeout. When I walked into the apartment, it was quiet, too quiet. I set the food on the counter and called out, "Emily? Jake?" No response. Frowning, I walked toward the hallway. As I passed by the living room, I heard a faint noise, a low murmur of voices. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. Peeking into the living room, I saw Emily and Jake sitting on the couch, their heads bent close together. They weren't touching, but the way they were talking, their voices low and intimate, made my stomach churn. They both looked up as I stepped into the room, their expressions a mix of surprise and guilt. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Emily said quickly, scooting a few inches away from Jake. "We were just talking." "About what?" I asked, glancing between them. Just stuff, Jake said, avoiding my eyes. The tension in the room was palpable. Well, I brought dinner, I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. Great, Emily said, standing up a little too quickly. Let's eat. Jake followed her into the kitchen, but I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty couch. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the way they'd been sitting together, the way their conversation had stopped the second I walked in. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. They were friends and friends talk. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next few days were tense. Jake and Emily still laughed and joked, but there was a new awkwardness in the air, like they knew I was watching them more closely. I started staying late at work on purpose, partly to avoid being home and partly to see what they'd do when they thought I wasn't around. One evening, I stayed late and watched the live feed from our doorbell camera, hoping to catch anything unusual. But when I got home, everything seemed normal. Emily was in bed, Jake's door was closed, and the apartment was quiet. For a moment, I felt like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, a few nights later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. I came home late again, this time unannounced. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the TV in the living room. As I walked in, I saw Jake and Emily sitting on the couch, laughing at something on the screen. Emily had her legs curled up under her, and Jake was leaning back, his arm draped casually along the back of the couch, not touching her, but close enough that it made me stop in my tracks. They both froze when they saw me, their laughter cutting off abruptly. Hey, I said, my voice tight. Hey, Emily said, straightening up. You're back early. Yeah, I said, glancing at Jake. What's going on? Just watching a movie, Jake said, avoiding my gaze. Cool, I said, though my heart was pounding. I went to bed that night, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. By the fourth week, my suspicions had grown too loud to ignore. Emily and Jake were careful, too careful, almost. They never crossed any obvious lines, but the way they acted around each other felt rehearsed, like they were putting on a show whenever I was around. And that made me even more suspicious. One night, I stayed late at work again. Emily didn't question it, she'd gotten used to me working extra hours recently. Don't overdo it, she said when I kissed her goodbye that morning. You'll burn yourself out. I'll be fine, I replied, trying to sound casual. The truth was, I wasn't staying late because I needed to. I was staying late to see if they'd slip up while I wasn't there. I'd already set up a small, discreet camera in the bedroom earlier that week. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do. Spying on my own home felt like a betrayal in itself. But the doubts were eating me alive, and I needed to know if my gut was right. That night, as I sat in my office pretending to work, I checked the live feed from the camera. Emily was in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone. Jake's door was closed. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. Emily stayed in the bedroom, Jake stayed in his room, and the apartment was quiet. When I got home around 11, everything looked normal. Emily was asleep, and Jake's lights were off. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe I really was overthinking things. The next few days passed uneventfully. I checked the camera feed every night when I stayed late, and every night it showed the same thing, nothing. Emily would either be in the bedroom or the living room, and Jake stayed in his room or the kitchen. I started to think maybe I'd made a mistake, that my suspicions were just paranoia fueled by stress. But then, something changed. One evening, I told Emily I'd be staying late again. That's like the third night this week, she said, frowning. Is everything okay? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just a lot to catch up on. She nodded but didn't press further. I left the apartment at my usual time, but instead of going to work, I parked my car a few blocks away and waited. If there was anything going on, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. After about an hour, I walked back to the apartment as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it through the door. I slipped my key into the lock and opened the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. The lights in the living room were on, and I could hear faint laughter. As I stepped inside, I froze. Jake and Emily were on the couch, their faces flushed with laughter. But it wasn't just the laughter that stopped me. It was the way Jake was sitting, leaning into Emily with his hand resting lightly on her thigh. They didn't notice me right away. When they finally looked up, their smiles vanished in an instant. "Matt," Emily said, her voice trembling. "You're home early." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My eyes flicked between the two of them, taking in the guilt on their faces, the way Emily quickly pulled away from Jake. "I forgot something at work," I said finally, my voice cold. Before either of them could respond, I turned and walked out the door. I don't remember how long I walked or where I went. I just remember the anger and the betrayal, the way my chest felt like it was caving in. I found myself at a bar, ordering the strongest drink they had. By the time I left, the anger had given way to something worse, numbness. I couldn't go back to the apartment, not yet. I didn't want to see either of them. Instead, I drove aimlessly, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I found myself parked in an empty lot, staring out at the darkness, trying to process what I'd just seen. Jake. My best friend. Emily. The woman I'd planned to spend my life with. Together. The image of them sitting on the couch, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, was burned into my mind. The way Jake's hand rested so casually on her thigh, like it belonged there. The way she didn't pull away until she saw me. I felt sick. By the time I finally dragged myself back to the apartment, the sun was starting to rise. I unlocked the door quietly, half hoping they were both still asleep so I wouldn't have to face them. The living room was empty, and Jake's door was closed. But when I walked into the bedroom, I found Emily sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn. "Matt," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "You think?" She flinched, but didn't look away. I need to explain." I dropped my bag on the floor and crossed my arms. "Go ahead," I said coldly. "Explain." She hesitated, wringing her hands. "It wasn't what it looked like." "Don't insult me, Emily," I snapped. "I saw him. I saw his hand on your leg. I saw the way you pulled away when you noticed me. So don't sit there and tell me it wasn't what it looked like." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. We didn't do anything," she stammered. "You didn't do anything?" I said, laughing bitterly. "So what, that was just friendly contact? Just a misunderstanding?" She looked down, her shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry?" I said, my voice rising. "You're sorry? That's all you've got?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Matt. I didn't. I love you." "Stop," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't you dare tell me you love me." Her lip trembled, but she didn't say anything else. I left the room before I said something I'd regret. My head was spinning, and I needed air. Jake was in the kitchen when I walked out, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his face going pale. "Matt, listen." "No," I said, pointing a finger at him. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to say anything. Nothing happened," he said quickly. "I swear it wasn't." "Don't," I growled, cutting him off. "I don't care what you have to say. You were my friend. My best friend. And this is how you repay me?" Jake opened his mouth, then closed it again, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "You're sorry? You're sorry? That's rich, Jake. That's really rich." He set the coffee cup down, his hands trembling. "Matt, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I said. "You need to pack your stuff and get the hell out of my apartment." Jake nodded slowly, his face a mixture of guilt and defeat. "I'll be out by tonight." "Good," I said, turning and walking out the door. I spent the day driving aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do next. My phone buzzed constantly, calls and texts from both Jake and Emily, but I ignored them all. I couldn't talk to either of them. Not yet. By the time I finally went home that evening, Jake was gone. His room was empty, the bed neatly made, and the key to the apartment sitting on the nightstand. Emily was still there, sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "I don't know what to do," she said softly. "Neither do I," I replied, my voice hollow. The days after Jake moved out were a blur. The apartment felt quieter, emptier, but not in a comforting way. It was like the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, the betrayal hanging in the air no matter how much I tried to ignore it. Emily stayed in the apartment, though we barely spoke. She tried a few times, tentative conversations about mundane things like groceries or bills, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. It wasn't anger, exactly, but a deep, hollow ache that I didn't know how to process. One evening, a few days after Jake left, Emily approached me as I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. "Matt," she said softly, sitting on the armrest. "Can we talk?" I didn't look at her. "What's there to talk about?" "Everything," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to explain." "You already tried that," I said flatly. "Please," she said, her tone desperate. "I know I messed up, but I need you to understand." "What?" I said, finally looking up at her. "What do I need to understand, Emily? That you and Jake were just having some harmless fun? That it didn't mean anything?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "It didn't mean anything," she said quietly. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You really think I'm going to believe that?" "I don't know what else to say," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want this to happen, Matt. I love you. I do. But what?" I demanded, standing up. "What excuse do you possibly have for what you did?" She wiped her eyes, looking down at her hands. "I don't have an excuse," she admitted. "I was stupid, and I let things go too far. But I didn't sleep with him." I stared at her, trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. "Even if that's true," I said finally, "it doesn't change what I saw. It doesn't change how I feel." Emily nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I know," she said. I want to fix this." "I don't know if you can," I said quietly. That night I slept in the guest room. I'd been avoiding it because the thought of stepping into the space Jake had occupied made my stomach turn, but the idea of sharing a bed with Emily felt unbearable. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The way they laughed together, the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention, the way they froze when I walked in that night. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about what it meant. The trust I'd had in both of them was gone, and I didn't know if it could ever come back. The next morning, I left for work without saying much to Emily. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands, her eyes red and tired. "Have a good day," she said softly as I grabbed my keys. I didn't respond. Over the next week, I threw myself into work, staying late every night and volunteering for extra projects just to avoid being home. The time apart gave me space to think, but it didn't bring any clarity. Emily texted me a few times during the day, small, careful messages asking how I was or whether I'd be home for dinner. I answered when I felt like it, but most of the time, I didn't. My coworkers noticed the change. "You okay, man?" one of them asked as we were grabbing coffee in the break room. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just busy." But I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. One night, after another late shift, I came home to find Emily sitting on the couch, a stack of papers in front of her. "What's this?" I asked, setting my bag down. She looked up, her expression tentative. "It's a list of therapists," she said. I thought maybe maybe we could go to counseling. Together. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. I know it's a long shot. She continued, her voice trembling. But I want to fight for us, Matt. I know I screwed up, but I don't want to lose you. I sat down across from her, the weight of her words settling over me. I don't know if I can do this, I said honestly. I don't know if I can look at you and not see, that night. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she said. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just please. Give me a chance to make this right. The idea of therapy lingered in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. I'd scoffed at the stack of papers Emily had left on the coffee table that night, but over the next few days, I kept catching myself glancing at them. It wasn't forgiveness I was after. I didn't even know if that was possible. But there was a small, nagging part of me that wondered if talking things through, with someone else guiding the conversation, might help me understand how we'd gotten to this point. Emily kept her distance, giving me space but not pushing me away completely. Her attempts to talk were measured and careful, her tone soft and hesitant, like she was afraid one wrong word would send me over the edge. One night, I finally broke the silence. Set it up, I said abruptly, nodding toward the papers. Emily looked up from her spot on the couch, her eyes wide with surprise. You mean, counseling? Yeah, I said, avoiding her gaze. If it'll help us figure this out, set it up. She nodded quickly, a small glimmer of hope in her expression. Okay, she said. I'll call tomorrow. The first session was awkward, to say the least. The therapist, a calm, middle-aged woman named Diane, started by asking us to explain why we were there. Emily went first, her voice trembling as she described the strain on our relationship and her regrets over the choices she'd made. I heard him, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. I let my guard down, and I made stupid, selfish choices. But I didn't mean to destroy what we have. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd spent days preparing for this moment. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, the months of unease, the betrayal I'd seen with my own eyes, the trust that had been shattered. I don't even know why I'm here, I said finally, my voice flat. I don't know if there's anything left to save. Diane nodded, her expression unreadable. It's normal to feel that way after a betrayal, she said. But the fact that you're here means part of you wants to try. That's a start. The sessions became a weekly ritual. Emily threw herself into the process, eager to show that she was willing to change. She apologized over and over, explaining that her closeness with Jake had been a mistake, a result of loneliness and poor judgment. I got caught up in the attention, she admitted during one session. It felt nice, I guess, to have someone pay that kind of attention to me. But I never wanted it to go as far as it did. Her words stung, but they also felt genuine. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me believed her. Outside of therapy, things were still tense. I slept in the guest room most nights, and our conversations were brief and guarded. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when things felt almost normal. Like when she laughed at a dumb joke I made, or when we found ourselves reminiscing about a vacation we'd taken years ago. Those moments made me wonder if there was still something worth fighting for. Meanwhile, Jake was a ghost. He'd left the apartment without a word after I told him to get out, and I hadn't heard from him since. No calls, no texts, no emails. Part of me was relieved. I didn't know if I could handle seeing him again. But another part of me wanted answers. I wanted to know what had really happened, what Jake had been thinking, and why he'd thrown away years of friendship for something so fleeting. I thought about reaching out more times than I could count, but every time I picked up my phone, I stopped myself. He didn't deserve an explanation, I told myself. He didn't deserve my time. One night, as Emily and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, she cleared her throat nervously. I've been thinking, she said, her voice hesitant. About what? I asked, setting down my fork. About us, she said. And about what happens next. I leaned back in my chair, waiting for her to continue. I know I hurt you, she said, her eyes fixed on the table. And I know I can't undo what happened. But I don't want to lose you, Matt. I don't. I want to keep fighting for this, for us. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I don't know, I said finally. I don't know if I can trust you again. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice firm. I'll keep going to therapy, I'll give you as much time as you need, I'll do anything, Matt. Just don't give up on me yet. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of dishonesty. But all I saw was raw vulnerability, the same vulnerability I'd fallen in love with years ago. Okay, I said finally. I'll try. But I can't promise anything. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. Therapy became a strange kind of routine. Every week, Emily and I would sit across from each other in Diane's office, peeling back the layers of everything that had gone wrong. The sessions were emotionally exhausting, but they also gave me clarity. Emily's admissions came slowly at first, hesitant and halting. She talked about feeling lonely when I started working late more often, and how Jake's easy charm had filled a void she didn't even know she'd been carrying. It wasn't an excuse, she said one day, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I wasn't thinking about how it would hurt you. I wasn't thinking about anything except how nice it felt to have someone notice me like that. Her honesty stung, but I appreciated that she wasn't sugarcoating it. I don't even recognize myself in all of this, she continued. It's like I became someone else, and now I'm left wondering how I let it get that far. Diane nodded, her pen gliding across her notepad. Acknowledging those feelings is important, she said. But what matters now is how you move forward. Outside of therapy, things remained tense. Emily was trying, I could see that. She'd stopped texting as often, put more effort into our time together, and even started asking me about my workday again, something that had fallen to the wayside long before Jake came into the picture. But despite her efforts, the weight of what had happened lingered between us. I wanted to believe her when she said she hadn't crossed the final line with Jake, but my mind kept replaying the moment I'd walked in on them, the look of guilt on her face, the way they froze like kids caught doing something they knew was wrong. The doubts gnawed at me, refusing to let go. One night, about a month after Jake had moved out, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There were so many pictures of the three of us from the early days of Jake's stay, smiling over dinners, laughing at inside jokes, looking like the perfect group of friends. I'd almost deleted them all out of spite but stopped myself. They weren't just pictures of Jake and Emily, they were pictures of a life I'd thought was solid. A life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. My thumb hovered over Jake's contact in my phone. I hadn't spoken to him since the night I told him to leave, and part of me wanted to keep it that way. But the questions I'd been avoiding were getting louder. Why did he do it? Why would he throw away years of friendship for a moment of selfishness? Before I could overthink it, I hit call. Jake picked up on the second ring. Matt, he said, his voice cautious. I need to know why, I said, skipping the pleasantries. Why did you do it? He sighed heavily. I don't know what to say, man. I messed up. I got caught up in something I shouldn't have. That's not good enough, I said, my voice sharp. You were my best friend. You knew what she meant to me. And you still did what you did. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said quickly. Well, you did, I snapped. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything. Jake was silent for a moment. I know I can't undo it, he said finally. But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I really am. I was an idiot, and I let things get out of hand. But it didn't mean anything, Matt. I swear. Didn't mean anything? I said, laughing bitterly. That's supposed to make me feel better? I don't know what else to say, he admitted. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. And I hate that I ruined what we had. His words rang hollow. Yeah, I said after a long pause. Me too. I hung up before he could respond. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation in my head. Jake's apology didn't feel like enough, but I wasn't sure what I'd expected. Closure? An explanation that would make everything make sense? I realized then that I wasn't going to get it, not from Jake, not from anyone. If I wanted to move forward, I had to find that closure for myself. The days after I spoke to Jake felt heavier than I expected. I thought that confronting him would give me some kind of clarity, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. His apologies, his explanations, they didn't erase the betrayal or undo the damage. Meanwhile, Emily continued to push for reconciliation. She was more attentive than she'd been in years, going out of her way to check in with me, cook my favorite meals, or plan quiet evenings together. But no matter how hard she tried, I couldn't shake the image of her and Jake on the couch, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. One evening, as we sat across from each other in the living room, Emily broke the silence. "Do you think we're making progress?" she asked hesitantly. I stared at her, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. She nodded, her expression pained but understanding. "I know it's hard to believe me, Matt, but I've told you everything. I've been honest. I didn't sleep with him, and I'll regret what I did for the rest of my life. But I need to know if there's still a chance for us." Her voice broke on the last word, and I could see the weight of the guilt she was carrying. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I said quietly. "And without trust, what's left?" Emily's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild it. I don't want to lose you, Matt." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. That night, I found myself sitting alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. I thought about everything we'd been through, 3 years of love, laughter, and shared dreams, all now overshadowed by 1 month of doubt and betrayal. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt, and fight for what we had. But another part of me couldn't let go of the pain, the image of Jake's hand on her leg, the laughter that had felt like a knife in my chest. I realized then that I had a choice to make. I could stay, try to rebuild what we'd lost, and hope that time would heal the wounds. Or I could walk away, cut my losses, and start over without her. Neither option felt right. But I couldn't keep living in limbo. The next day, I told Emily I needed space. "I'm not saying it's over," I said, watching as her face fell. "But I need time to figure out what I want, what I can handle. And I can't do that with you here." Her lip trembled, but she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "If that's what you need." She packed a bag that afternoon, leaving the apartment with tears streaming down her face. I watched her go, my chest tight and my mind racing. I didn't know if I was making the right decision, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. For the next few weeks, I focused on myself. I went to therapy on my own, unpacking the anger and pain I'd been carrying. I spent time with friends, went for long runs, and tried to rediscover the parts of myself I'd lost in the chaos. Emily called occasionally, checking in to see how I was doing. Our conversations were short and guarded, but there was no hostility, just a mutual understanding that we both needed time. One evening, as I sat on the balcony watching the sunset, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. The betrayal still hurt, but the sharp edges of that pain had dulled, replaced by a strange kind of acceptance. Jake had made his choice. Emily had made hers. And now, it was time for me to make mine. When Emily came back to the apartment a week later, I met her at the door. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded, her expression nervous but hopeful. I led her to the couch, sitting down across from her. "I've done a lot of thinking," I began. "And I've realized something." Her eyes searched mine, waiting. "I can't go back to the way things were," I said. "I can't pretend this didn't happen, and I can't promise that I'll ever fully trust you again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she stayed silent. "But," I continued, "I'm willing to try. If you're willing to put in the work, to be patient with me, then maybe we can figure this out together." Emily let out a shaky breath, nodding quickly. I am, she said, her voice breaking. I'll do whatever it takes, Matt. I promise. Emily's return to the apartment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that felt fragile and uncertain. We both knew it wouldn't be easy, but the fact that we'd chosen to try felt like a small victory in itself. The first few days were awkward, filled with careful words and guarded smiles. Emily went out of her way to show that she was committed, leaving her phone face up on the table, texting me updates when she went out, and asking for my input on even the smallest decisions. It was a start, but trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight. Therapy remained a cornerstone of our attempts to heal. Diane encouraged us to be honest, even when it hurt, and there were plenty of moments when it did. One session in particular left me feeling raw. I keep thinking about what you told me, I said, my voice tight. About how Jake made you feel seen. Like I wasn't enough. Emily's face crumpled. That's not what I meant, she said quickly. Then what did you mean? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I felt disconnected, she admitted. Not because of you, but because of me. I let myself drift, and instead of talking to you about it, I let Jake fill that gap. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't right. But it wasn't about you not being enough, Matt. You are enough. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to believe her, but the scars ran deep. Diane stepped in, her voice calm and measured. Rebuilding trust takes time, Matt. It's not about forgetting what happened, it's about deciding if you can move forward with what you know. I nodded, though the weight of those words stayed with me long after the session ended. As the weeks passed, things began to shift. The tension in the apartment slowly started to ease, replaced by a cautious kind of normalcy. We started spending more time together, watching movies, cooking meals, and going on walks to clear our heads. There were moments when it almost felt like the old days, when things were simple and easy. But those moments were always shadowed by the knowledge of what had happened. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the city lights, Emily broke the silence. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make this up to you, she said softly. I glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. I don't think you can, I said honestly. But it's not about making it up to me. It's about proving that we can still build something out of this mess. She nodded, a small, tentative smile tugging at her lips. I'm willing to try. As long as it takes. The turning point came a few weeks later, during one of our therapy sessions. Why did you decide to stay? Diane asked me. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. I don't know, I said at first. But as I sat there, the answer began to take shape. Because I still care, I said finally. Because even after everything, there's a part of me that believes we're worth fighting for. And because walking away felt like giving up, and I'm not ready to do that. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand. For the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. From that point on, things started to feel different. The wounds were still there, but they didn't feel as raw. We both began to lean into the process more fully, letting go of the guardedness that had kept us at arm's length. I wouldn't call it forgiveness, not yet. But it felt like we were moving in the right direction. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, Emily and I began to rebuild our relationship. Trust was a fragile thing, and while the cracks were still visible, we were learning how to navigate them together. Our therapy sessions continued to be a cornerstone of our progress. Diane guided us through difficult conversations, helping us confront the lingering doubts and fears that threatened to pull us apart. One afternoon, as we sat in her softly lit office, Diane posed a question that caught us both off guard. Have you considered what forgiveness looks like for each of you? She asked. I glanced at Emily, then back at Diane. I guess I hadn't thought about it in those terms, I admitted. Emily nodded. For me, forgiveness means letting go of the guilt I've been carrying, she said softly. But I know that's not something I can rush. Diane turned to me. And for you, Matt? I took a deep breath. Forgiveness, for me, means accepting that the past can't be changed, I said. It's about deciding whether I can move forward without holding this over Emily's head forever. Emily reached for my hand, her eyes searching mine. I hope you can, she whispered. At home, we began to create new memories. We took up cooking together, experimenting with recipes that often ended in laughter and the occasional culinary disaster. We started a small garden on the balcony, nurturing seedlings that slowly blossomed under our care. Each shared experience felt like a step toward healing, a way to redefine our relationship on new terms. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of pink and orange, Emily turned to me. Do you ever think about the future? She asked. All the time, I replied, sipping my tea. She hesitated before continuing. Do you see me in it? I looked at her, the soft glow of the fading sunlight highlighting the hope in her eyes. I do, I said. But it's different now. We're different. She nodded. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe not, I agreed. We've been through a lot. But I think it's made us stronger in some ways. Emily smiled gently. I want to keep building on that. With you. A few days later, I received an unexpected message from Jake. It was a simple text. Hey Matt, I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to meet and talk if you're willing. No pressure. Just let me know. I stared at the screen, a mix of emotions swirling within me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave the past where it was. But another part of me recognized that this might be the final piece of closure I needed. After discussing it with Emily and giving it much thought, I decided to meet him. We met at a quiet cafe on a Saturday afternoon. Jake looked different, tired, perhaps a bit older than when I'd last seen him. Thanks for meeting me, he said, his voice subdued. I nodded. I figured it was time. There was a long pause before he spoke again. I wanted to apologize face to face. What I did was unforgivable, and I've regretted it every day since. I listened quietly as he continued. I've been doing a lot of thinking, trying to understand why I let things get so out of hand, he said. I was in a bad place, but that's no excuse. I betrayed your trust, and I know I can't fix that. You're right, I said calmly. You can't. But I can choose to move past it. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. Does that mean you forgive me? I considered his question. I think it means I'm ready to let go of the anger, I replied. Holding on to it doesn't help either of us. Jake nodded slowly. I understand. Thank you. We talked a while longer, keeping the conversation light. As we parted ways, I felt a weight lift, a sense of finality that had been missing before. When I returned home, Emily was waiting. How did it go? She asked tentatively. It went well, I said. I think I got the closure I needed. She smiled softly. I'm glad. Life didn't miraculously become perfect after that, but it felt more manageable. Emily and I continued to work on our relationship, acknowledging that while the past would always be a part of our story, it didn't have to define our future. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, Emily turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, I was thinking, she began. Maybe we could take a trip together. Just us. Somewhere new. I looked at her, considering the idea. I like that, I said. A fresh start. She nodded, her eyes hopeful. Exactly. We eventually decided on a small coastal town neither of us had visited before. The change of scenery was refreshing, and the sound of the waves provided a soothing backdrop to our days. As we walked along the beach, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace. Thank you for giving us another chance, Emily said softly. I squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for not giving up. We stood there for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting golden hues across the water. In that moment, I realized that while the journey had been painful and uncertain, it had led us to a place of understanding and renewed commitment. Maybe trust could be rebuilt after all. Returning home from our trip, Emily and I settled back into our lives with a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer held us captive. We continued therapy for a while longer, eventually deciding together that we were ready to move forward on our own. Our relationship wasn't the same as before, it was different, matured by adversity and strengthened by resilience. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the familiar sunset, Emily rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" she asked. I wrapped my arm around her, feeling a quiet confidence. "Yeah," I replied. "I think we already are."